Hello everyone. Hello everyone, that'll wake you up. Welcome to the session on communicating controversial collections. My name is Grant and I work with the collections that you'll see in this presentation we'll be discussing today. Co-hosted by Charlotte, who's our MDC coordinator, who works on the Manchester Digital Collections, and she'll be talking about sharing controversial collections digitally, online, and her experience with the Manchester Digital Collection with the Rags. So, first off, we want to frame the discussion which we'll have in the second half of this session. We wanted to give as much time as possible for table discussions between everyone. So halfway through the session we're going to take you all behind the screens and we're going to have sort of a bit of a 5-minute discussion period and then a 10-minute round table where we all give our thoughts and our views on some of the themes that we're discussing here. But effectively what we want to do is show you some of the controversial collections that we're dealing with, some of the challenges that we're facing, and then get some feedback which will inform our practice going forwards. For those discussions, we'd like to frame it as a kind and empathetic discussion. People coming from all sorts of backgrounds and different perspectives, but just be aware that some of the themes that are being discussed in this session, things like sexism, racism, ableism, are not just theoretical or academic for some people. And there'll be members of the audience who will have experienced these things as part of everyday life, sadly. So just make sure you're an active listener and that you're understanding and empathetic for where people are coming from and that you listen to their point of view and their views, which I'm sure you all will, because we're a very supportive community. So I'll commit the first cardinal sin of PowerPoint, which is to put a load of text on the screen. I won't be reading it out word for word. Effectively what I want to get across is that controversial collections are high risk, high reward, in the sense that they have a high impact on people, both positively and negatively, and the potential for getting things wrong, just as the potential for getting things right, is greater than for collections which people don't care about as much. Now there's a tension here. Effectively, as curators of collections, what we want to do is make things accessible and open to people, but with controversial collections, there are limits to how accessible we want these things to be. On the one hand, we don't want to share material inappropriately or share inappropriate material that people aren't prepared for that might cause distress or trauma. People scrolling through Twitter or eating their morning breakfast cereal don't want to come across some content without appropriate warnings and without knowing what they're getting into, especially if they're following John Rylands for the pretty pictures of the building or whatever. But at the same time, as an academic institution, as a research library, we have a responsibility and a mission to make this material accessible. We commit a huge amount of resources to maintaining a lot of this material. So if for nothing else than to justify that we have this stuff and we spend time on curating it, and we basically need to share this in some form, somehow, or at least have a plan on how to share it in the future. So effectively, we want to strike a balance here between making this material accessible, but also protecting people from harm. And the point at the bottom here is that controversial collections are controversial because people care about them and they have an impact. And that's shown by the fact that this is in the plenary session in a sellout crowd today. That it really vindicates the work that we've been doing on this. So this session is framed around the Rags, which are a recent Manchester Digital Collection exhibition. And this was produced by students in the 20th century. 1920s through to 1960s, we provided a selection of these magazines, and this, in this section of the presentation, I'll be sharing some examples of some of the racist and sexist content from those magazines. The Rags were produced for a charitable purpose. They were used to raise money for children's charities, for hospitals around Manchester, and they were produced by quite an overwhelmingly white male student body. And so this really reflects some of their attitudes and some of the mainstream approaches to race and sex of students at the time. And this was presented onto the Manchester Digital Collections in March, as you saw earlier in the presentation. So here's some of the basic sexist stuff that goes on in the Rags. This will probably sadly be familiar to a lot of people: the sexualization of women, some naked or cartoon female forms. A lot of it's fairly puerile student stuff. You have women in submissive roles being objectified. You have sort of traditional heterosexual relationships where the men are after the women's sort of sexual appeal, the women are after the money and the kind of access to higher positions and all this kind of stuff. Then we move over to the racist stuff, which is perhaps more difficult. And here we have the students portraying other races and other cultures as foreign and other, and doing so in a very disrespectful kind of mocking way. In a sense, it's very much punching down. So you have African people being portrayed as cannibals here, we have offensive descriptions of Arabic people, caricatures of tribal sort of African dress, and then sort of kind of slightly more subtly but almost more insidious on this page on the right hand side, we have black faces being presented as, or implied as dirty compared to white faces. This is actually supposed to be a mockery of a temperance campaign, but it actually reveals a lot more about attitudes to race in that. And so that's the kind of material that we put up online, produced by university students and available for people to access with no controls. Well, that's not precisely true. We didn't just tweet this material out because we felt that this wouldn't be appropriate. So what we did was I worked with academics who work with this material and have community-based practice to inform a blog post which presented these magazines in their context before you access them. And anytime we shared this on social media, the access came through the blog post. So we wouldn't tweet out individual pages or the ragrags themselves. We would tweet out the blog post, and then people would read the blog post, and when they got to the end, that could then feed into actually accessing the magazines. And we didn't get a backlash to this. People were, responded quite well. In fact, the problem was that we had a positive response to the ragrags. Certainly a problem for me when I was looking at these comments and trying to respond to them. Instead of people saying, oh, this material's horrible, we actually got some people saying, yeah, I really enjoyed the rags. If you can't see these on the screen, people saying, yeah, I love these were part of my childhood, or I love buying them every year, the rag parades were great. And that created a real problem, which I still haven't been able to really figure out the solution to, which is how to, in one sense, present the rags as something that's negative, or in a neutral way, saying this has a content warning and it has racist and sexist content, while at the same time responding to people who have a very nostalgic view of it, different audiences, people saying these are great. I don't really know how to do that without seeming two-faced and duplicitous. So it's something that I'd be really interested in feedback on, how we do that effectively. And finally, my final slide before I pass on to Charlotte, there are other complications as well. So I sent out some material from the Christian Brethren archive in advance of the session, which you didn't have to read, but effectively there's stuff in there that's very, very controversial, very difficult material. And the Christian Brethren archive is funded by the Lang Trust, whose purpose is to promote Christian faith and values. They are founded by a Brethren member, and so question marks exist over whether, if we were hypercritical of this on social media, how that would go down with the funding body for the archive, whether we would feel able to be critical of that material. And there's been a similar incident where some research by academics has been kind of snipped out by the Manchester Science Park because it made they felt like it might reflect badly on them and their activities. So that's just to give you a primer and an example of some of the difficulties we face, which Charlotte will be going through in a little bit more detail as well.
Hi everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Charlotte. I am the content coordinator for Manchester Digital Collections, or MDC, which means I'm very much involved in the operational side of things, so everything that needs to happen for a digital collection to be created and then published on our MDC platform. And I'm going to be talking about this rag collection very briefly from an MDC perspective. So first of all, for a bit of context, this first slide very briefly outlines the MDC process. So from a proposal for a new digital collection through planning and preparation, whether that's new digitisation, the enhancing or creating of metadata before being uploaded to our non-live staging site, and then a process of review and troubleshooting before the collection is published on our MDC live site and released into the wilds of the internet. So rags and MDC. I think it's fair to say that considering the really explicitly discriminatory content of the RAGRAGS collection really caused us to reflect on the appropriateness and the usefulness of some of our MDC processes when approaching problematic or discriminatory material. The process for this collection was initiated during lockdown when we were focusing on what was often legacy metadata, images that already existed, and transferring those from Luna, our image management system, onto MDC. At that time, we were also developing processes for MDC. MDC is a very cross-team, cross-directorate group of people, so we have specialists from all kinds of different areas, so photography specialists, metadata specialists, software developers, researchers, curators, heritage assistants. So that allowed us to have a very broad discussion about this collection within the context of the MDC governance groups and also outside of those groups too. An immediate change has been that we've revised our proposal process for new digital collections to explicitly flag material that is likely or is discriminatory or culturally sensitive right at the beginning of the process. And that allows us to build into the project appropriate time for consultation, for reflection, for research, rather than being very deadline driven, which can be the case with other MDC projects. We're very aware, however, that we need and can do much more, and I really hope that thoughts that are shared as part of this discussion and hopefully after the session as well will inform our evolving practice in this area. So when we talk about digitisation projects and digital collections, often the emphasis is very much on maximum discoverability, maximum access, as Grant was saying. MDC itself is an open access platform, and of course we want as many people to be using it as much as possible. However, opening up access to material that is culturally sensitive or discriminatory is of course a significant responsibility that needs careful consideration. And some of the quotes that I've shared on this slide indicate that really the very nature of digital content is that it is released in the context of the whole internet. It can be stumbled across unexpectedly, immediately, without context, and open to reuse in ways that we perhaps don't anticipate or can't control. But what we digitise and how we present this content is integral to the way that we understand the past and interpret the material that is presented. So I think balancing access to our collections with accountability for what we are publishing, appropriate context, and a choice for users, so Grant has already talked about content warnings, is really important. I've noted three main considerations from an MDC perspective on this slide, but I really do invite you to challenge these in the discussion, and as I say, this is from an MDC perspective. So accountability, who is accountable for the content we publish? That's often quite a complicated question when we have lots of people involved in projects, and who are we accountable to? Context, so how do we provide appropriate context for our collections? Metadata is obviously hugely important here. How we are describing the content, who is involved in the description of the content. Cataloguers, of course, have immense power over the way that material is interpreted and access is opened up. And finally, choice. So as I say, do our users have a choice about the material that they engage with? Not only our end users, but our colleagues internally that work with the material. And how can we foreground these choices? So we've talked about content warnings, but what are other ways, including site functionality, further revision of internal processes, that we can make that choice explicit? So I hope that gives you a very brief flavour of some of the considerations for this collection. We are now going to move to the back of the room where we have, I think, 6 tables of 10 people for a discussion within your tables, and then hopefully about 10 minutes at the end for a feedback and a roundtable discussion. We have got some discussion points to inform those conversations, so I'll just briefly run through them now, and then we'll move to the back of the room. So immediate responses to some of the content that we've shared, both in this presentation, content that you may have experience with, and some of the content that Grant shared via email as well. What do successful ways of talking about controversial collections have in common? Can we draw out any themes? And how can we support each other to approach difficult topics appropriately? So if I can ask you to move to the back of the room and sit on the tables